Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and what comes to mind when you think of Harlem, New York? What comes to mind? Whom do you see in your mind? Do you see Jews? Did you know that once upon a time, Harlem was Jewish? It's one of the fabulous stories of Jewish Americana. And like so much of our people's history, most Jews today know little to nothing about Jewish life that was in Harlem. And enter Dr. Jeffrey S. Gurock, Libby M. Klaperman Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University, a prolific author of more than 15 books on various aspects of American Jewish history, including A Modern Heretic and a Traditional Community, Mordecai M. Kaplan, Orthodoxy and American Judaism, for which Jeff was awarded the Saul Weiner Prize from the American Jewish Historical Society for the best book written in the field. Jeff Gurock has also written Orthodox Jews in America, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. His recent study entitled Jews in Gotham, New York Jews in a Changing City, 1920 to 2010, won him the Everett Family Foundation Award for the Best Nonfiction Jewish Book of 2012 from the Jewish Book Council. And in a lighter vein, Jeff's also written Judaism's Encounter with American Sports, and a fascinating alternative history entitled Holocaust Averted. But Jeff Gurock's very first book, back in 1978, was entitled When Harlem Was Jewish, 1870 to 1930. And as we meet on this edition of L'Chaim, Jeff Gurock's most recent gem is a revisit to Jewish Harlem in a wonderful book entitled The Jews of Harlem, The Rise, Decline, and Revival of a Jewish Community. And Jeff's a longtime personal friend whom I've been privileged to have on L'Chaim many times from the very beginning of this series. He's always been a fan favorite, as he is wherever a community invites him as a scholar in residence, which is a real treat for any community. Jeff's an outstanding teacher and raconteur, and it's so wonderful to have you back where you belong in that chair at L'Chaim's desk. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. And it's true, I go back with you in terms of friendship many, many years, but more importantly in this context, I go back to the days when L'Chaim was a radio show on WMCA radio, and you were making a very important contribution back then. And it's a thrill to see how JBS has grown. And I watch your show incessantly, and I marvel at the wealth and breadth of your knowledge and engagement in so many Jewish topics, and topics that are more important in this book, namely the contemporary life of American Jews, you know, how we fit in the world, issues of anti-Semitism. So I'm a good friend and a very, very committed viewer of your show, and everyone should watch the show. And it's really a wonderful contribution. In all seriousness, it's a wonderful contribution to American Jewish life. So congratulations. So I guess we're done.
That's so sweet of you to say.
But it's true. It's true.
And it's true. You have been at my side for, we started in 1979, Jeff. It's been quite a number of decades already.
Right.
And you've been there every step of the way, and you've been a major, major part of what's made L'Chaim successful. So I'm very grateful to you and for your friendship and Pam's friendship. And we've had a wonderful time together. It should go on for decades and decades more.
Absolutely.
And now you've written this wonderful book, The Jews of Harlem. It is a revisit for you. And I mean, I have so many questions to ask you, but this must be asked of you everywhere you go. Why did you decide to do a second version of your very first book?
Well, there are two pieces. You were kind enough to mention that I've written a number of books subsequent to my book When Harlem Was Jewish.
Yes.
And frankly, everything that I've done in scholarship over the last almost 40 years was derivative from the original book When Harlem Was Jewish. So piece number one is that I wrote a book on Orthodoxy in America. How did I come to write that book? Because in Harlem, I encountered some of the first manifestations of 20th century Orthodoxy. And one of the things that I've emphasized in my work is that until the contemporary era, the lines of demarcation between what is Orthodox and what is conservative in terms of congregational life and congregate life were very similar. Now, where did the idea come from? It came from the fact that I discovered an institution in Harlem 40 years ago called the Uptown Talmud Torah, which was on 111th Street and Lexington Avenue, which had a Board of Education made up of a mixed cohort of American Orthodox leaders and people affiliated with the Jewish Theological Seminary, and the principal, later dean, of the Teachers Institute of the Jewish Theological Seminary,
which is the Conservative Movement's rabbinical school.
That's correct, was located on the premises of the Uptown Talmud Torah. And the dean, first principal, then the dean, was a man named Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan. So it all connected, so everything was connected. The other piece is, you were kind enough to mention that I wrote a book about Judaism in sports, which is a serious book. It's really a serious book, using the metaphor of sports to understand American Jewish life.
Yes.
And that, in a sense, is derivative from the fact that on 116th Street, between 5th and Lenox Avenue, now Malcolm X Boulevard, there was a shul with a pool called the Institutional Synagogue, which was the forerunner of the Jewish Center Synagogue on the west side and every synagogue center in the United States. So any rabbi who has the idea, conservative, Orthodox, and sometimes Reform, that we will let people come to play and hope that through play they'll end up praying, is somehow connected to the Harlem experience through the IS. So point number one is, why did I write the book? I felt that the original book didn't have all the things that I learned. I try to be a teacher, so I've learned a lot, and I'm bringing it back into the first half of the book. The other part of my interest in Harlem is, how shall I put it, somewhat hubristic. Harlem is coming back as a Jewish community. The last chapter is called The Beginnings of Return.
Yes.
And I've been known, for better or for worse, as Harlem's Jewish historian, and I want to grab that moniker and stay with it. So this book revisits the first 60 years and then has 85 more years of Jewish life, bringing it up to the contemporary time. And just one last story. When I did Jews in Gotham, I got a call or a letter from a family that lived in Harlem saying, we read your Harlem book and we want you to know that Jews are back. So I opened the Jews in Gotham book that was published in 2012 with a saga of this family living Borgenicht, the Borgenicht family, who interestingly enough no longer live in Harlem. They've since moved out over the last 5 years, who were living in an 1880s brownstone that was remodeled. And when I wrote the Gotham book, I said, why don't I open with them, tell their story, and then flash back to the 19th.
Yes. And Bowie, they're in this book as well.
They appear in it. Oh, there are other people in this book, thanks for mentioning, who don't appear in the first book. For example, the first book was initially my doctoral dissertation called The Jewish Community of Harlem. And one of the reasons, I guess, collateral reasons for writing the first book is that the Gurocks, my father's family, grew up in Harlem.
This is very important.
Well, I always...
No, it's important because there was a very profound personal connection for you through your family. And you're very honest about that in the second book. Mm-hmm. That also is part of what is the fun for you, yes?
Right. But in the original book, as my first, foray into the world of scholarship, you don't write about yourself, right. Okay? But in this one, I talk about the fact that my father was one of 6 boys and 1 girl in the family.
Jack
Gurock, right? Who appears in my sports book because he became a wrestler and wrestled under an assumed name. So it's all connected back and forth. But here's the serious point. I felt liberated enough as a senior scholar, as a rapidly aging scholar, that in this book I'll write a little bit about my family. But back 40 years ago, one of the things I emphasized in the original book is that the image we had of Harlem was derived from the classic immigrant novel written by the editor of the Jewish Daily Forward named Abraham Kahan called The Rise of David Levinsky. That book tells the story of the immigrant boy who makes his money and moves uptown. He's living on Lenox Avenue, a beautiful apartment, cross ventilation, dumb waiters, and his wife wears jewels. Well, that didn't apply to my grandmother and grandfather. And I said, gee, which story is correct? Well, it turns out in the original book, which is repeated here, that there were 2 Harlems. There were Harlem of poor people and Harlem of affluent people, and the 2 communities didn't always get along, which is another piece, and that is we often people I think incorrectly talk about the German Jews and the East European Jews not getting along. The German Jews lording it over the East European Jews. Well, one of the things I argued in both Harlem books is that maybe the conflict is not over where you came from, but how long you were in America. And those who were in America the longest time are looking down and conflicting with those who came a little bit later. So the Gurock story is nice. It's a personal story. I think it's engaging a little bit, but more importantly, it reflects a larger story, and that's a story of multiplicity of Jewish identities in this area, which at one point had 175,000 Jews. It's incredible.
It's incredible.
You know, I've spoken about this book literally for 40 years all over the world, and you know, when I'm on the subway or go over the Mulberry Bridge, and I see the word Harlem, I sort of jump back because it's so much engaged and so much part of my own consciousness. So that's why I wrote this book.
That's wonderful. You do know that for most Americans in general, the word Harlem is associated with the African American community.
Correct.
It's black. It is poor. The dividing line was 96th Street at one point in time. And
on the east side of Harlem.
Correct.
That becomes El Barrio, becomes Latino.
Yes.
110th Street, northbound, north of Central Park, becomes the African American enclave.
Exactly.
Right.
And what you do is you give us a different image of what it was like for Jews at the turn of the century into the first decades of the 20th century. And your point in part is, again, that there is migration of Jews inside New York City. Yes?
Correct.
Talk about that migration for one more moment.
Okay.
The typical migration.
Well, as of 1900, there's literally no more room on the Lower East Side for East European Jews. So that when my ancestors came to America in 1905, there was no room down there. And the reason for that was, and again, these stories continue to be part of New York City's history. I also want to say to do American Jewish history properly, you have to have a handle on Jewish history and also American history and also the metropolis that I'm studying.
Yes.
A number of ill-conceived urban renewal efforts downtown contract the amount of space available in the immigrant enclave. So for example, bridges are built, Manhattan Bridge, Williamsburg Bridge, linking Manhattan to Brooklyn. Next time you go to Ratner's restaurant, oh, you can't go there anymore, it's closed. But I used to tell my students, next time you go to Ratner's restaurant, take a right turn and take a look at the Williamsburg Bridge, how it comes out at you from the East River, and you can see where 17,000 people lost their homes. Manhattan Bridge similarly. They build what are called public parks and piers, swimming piers or pools for the people. Essex Street Park, Mulberry Bend Park, Grand Street Park, they're still there today. Great idea, making it healthier for those Jews who live downtown. Problem is, when you condemn buildings, if you own the building, I guess through eminent domain, you get compensated. So what happens to the people who lose their homes? And if you think this is an early 20th century story, it's not. It's a 21st century story. And in fact, it's a story that I tell a little bit about the Harlem neighborhood in contemporary times. So people who are living downtown are forced to leave before their time. And what do they bring with them? They bring with them Yiddish culture. Mm-hmm. They may bring with them Orthodox religious values. And they live a different existence in what becomes El Barrio than the Levinskys who move uptown. I thought back 40 years ago that I might call that chapter David Levinsky Has Risen, but I thought it had too much Christological overtones to it. But the point here is, when we look at neighborhoods from a distance, they look as if they are monolithic, but in fact they are very, very complicated. But you also would ask me a question, I think, about Jews and African Americans. So I think one of the points I'm trying to make in this book, both in 1900, 1910, and the 20s down to the present day, is that there's no one Jewish story. There's no singular Jewish story with reference to African Americans. And conversely, there's no singular African American story. So you have throughout this century of engagement both moments of competition, of crisis, of cooperation, of friendship between African Americans and Jews. And in fact, to be totally candid with you, when I first thought about writing about Harlem 40 years ago, well, I've been telling the story widely recently. I was a graduate student at Columbia University. I was born in the late 40s, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I lived through an era in New York City history where Jews and blacks began as friends and then became less than friends. I think of the late 60s teachers' strike, which pitted Jews against blacks and vice versa. So when I got to Columbia and I wanted to write a dissertation, I said to one of my advisors, you know what I want to do? I want to write a book called Jews and Blacks in the Age of Jim Crow, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, to 1954. And my professor said, he happened to be an Israeli of all people, he said, to do this right, maybe you should choose a neighborhood. Don't look at rabbis. Don't look at pastors and preachers. Don't look at politicians. Try to look at the experience of the average Jane and Joe, Moshe and Marsha, and how they interact with each other. So I looked out the window, Fairweather Hall in Columbia. I looked down the bluff, and I said, there it is. Of course, he said I should study 4 cities, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, and Boston. I think those are 4 cities. Had I listened to his advice literally, I'd still be working on the book today. But okay, be that as it may. The important point is I was already engaged in studying black-Jewish relations. So I've now done it twice. I've brought it up to 1930, and then there's 85 years in between of good, bad, and very ugly between Jews and blacks.
Yes. By the way, how has the African American community reacted to this book, if they've reacted at all?
The only reaction I've had up until now,
yes,
and frankly, I'd like to hear, I've made some friends among African American historians. For example, there's a gentleman named John Reddick, who is a historian of black music, who's been doing a lot of writing about the connections between Jews and blacks, whether it's Fannie Hurst or Fannie Bryce or Al Jolson or George Gershwin, etc. So he's a good friend, and he taught me a lot. One of the things that's new here is that I engage cultural history. I talk about music. I talk about the Harlem Renaissance, which I didn't do because that postdates the Jewish life in the 1920s. There's a historian named Christopher Bell who does work on Harlem. He's a good friend and a confidant. As far as the black community is concerned, well, the only reaction I've had is that there's a wonderful group called, and you know I'm a sports fan and an athlete, there is a group called Harlem Hockey. They teach African American kids hockey in Central Park, and they've just had an event honoring the first African-American player in the NHL, and they asked me for a copy of my book to be one of the gifts to give to people. So, to be frank with you, the scholarly reviews have not come out yet. There's been a lot of interest among the Jewish media. You're very kind to have me to talk about it, whether it's Jewish Week or the Forward Israeli publications. It will take a while as far as that's concerned, but it's only a start.
Okay. I want you to imagine you're with our audience at 116th Street and Fifth Avenue. What would you show us?
Okay. So it's one of the wide thoroughfares of Harlem.
116th and Fifth Avenue.
Right. So let's imagine it is the first day of Rosh Hashanah. You would see...
What's the year?
Oh, let's say it's 1918.
Okay.
You could see hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews walking up and down those streets while services are going on. One of the things I emphasize in all of my books about New York and about large cities is that very often Jewish identification takes place through walking the streets of the Jewish neighborhoods, notwithstanding the fact that on either side of the street there are magnificent and very important synagogues. But if you stopped to go into a synagogue and you looked on the south side of the street between 5th and Lenox Avenue, you would see Congregation Ohab Zedek.
Ohab Zedek.
Which today and for the longest time has been on 95th Street and between Columbus and Amsterdam Avenue. And if you walked in, you probably walked in to hear the singing of Yeshiva Rosenblatt, the most famous chazan of that period. He's the cantorial voice of Al Jolson in the jazz singer, praying. If you stayed longer, you might hear an English language sermon delivered by Bernard Drachman, who was one of the first modern Orthodox rabbis in the 20th century. He rode the circuit between two congregations, 68th Street, what was Congregation Zichron Ephraim, which is today Park East Synagogue. Rabbi Arthur Schneier is the rabbi there, has been there for many years, and Ohab Zedek. And if you stayed long, you might hear, or come a different time, you might hear a High German sermon delivered by Rabbi Dr. Philip Hillel Klein. And according to the autobiography of Ira Eisenstein, who was Mordecai Kaplan's son-in-law, he and his father were in that shul, and Klein was a great Talmid Chacham and a wonderful fellow and a terrible speaker. And when he got up to speak, both the boys and the men snuck out, and the boys played a little bit of box ball on the street. So now, you had Drachman, a great darshan in English, and you had Yosef Rosenblatt, the great cantor. And they didn't get along. And in Drachman's autobiography, he says that the people came to shul to hear him preach. And in a biography of Yosef Rosenblatt, written by his son Samuel Rosenblatt in Baltimore, says, no, they came to hear me pray. So the truth probably lies somewhere in between. But this is a great story, I think. Before Rosenblatt comes on the scene, the prior leading cantor, and by the way, cantors back then were considered, I guess the term would be rainmakers. They thought if you got a melodious cantor, that will draw Jews in. So his predecessor was a cantor Meisels, who was also a great singer. And they would sell tickets for his performances, not only on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but once a month in traditional congregations, the week where we bless the new moon, Shabbat Mevorachim. That's a very important cantorial piece. They were selling tickets for him for his performances. To make the story even sadder or more interesting, there was some scalping going on because it was so important to be there. And I can't show you that tobacco store across the street, but there was a tobacco store where you could buy those tickets, and it was a bit of a scandal.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a bit of a scandal. And then, if you look, you went further down the block, the gym and the pool and the art room and the music room and the library of the institutional synagogue would have been closed, but you would have heard Rabbi Herbert S. Goldstein, again, one of the early modern Orthodox rabbis. And just an interesting point about yeshiva's history, the first two professors of homiletics were Goldstein and Drachman. So again, a lot of things that happened on that block were emblematic of the beginnings of denominationalism in the 20th century. And then if you went 2 blocks up, there would have been congregation Yeshiva Zedek.
Where are we now?
We're 118th Street between 5th and 6th. And if you went a little further north and a few steps west, you would have Temple Israel, which was the first congregation, a Reformed congregation, which moved in the 1920s to 93rd Street. And today, I believe it's on 75th Street and Park Avenue. So those were the signature major synagogues in the area, but we know that there were over 150 small congregations, shtibels, storefront synagogues. So the Gurocks prayed in the Homler synagogue because my people came from Homel or Gomel in White Russia, and it was a Landsmannschaft synagogue. That's a synagogue of people from the same hometown who want to pray with their paisan. I say paisan because it's not a Jewish story, it's an immigrant story, and non-Jews would understand that someone who comes from a particular place in Italy might want to pray with people of their own kind. So you have to have a handle on the fancy synagogues who are in Central Harlem and the poor people's synagogues that are in East Harlem.
And if I was there on a Thursday, a Tuesday, it's not Chabad, it's not a Yom Tov. It's not about synagogue now.
Right.
It's about whom do I see on the streets and what do they look like?
Well, they look like Americanized, in Central Harlem.
Yes.
You look like an Americanized East European Jews. Their parents would be speaking Yiddish. The young people would be speaking English. Remember, they've gone to the public schools and they've been indoctrinated to speak English on the street and perhaps Yiddish at home. There would be innumerable stores, Jewish stores and stores owned by Jews. And there will be a Jewish economic presence in Harlem down to almost the contemporary day, so that this type of social conviviality where you're bumping into Jews would be taking place on an ongoing basis wherever you would go.
And what percentage of the population in this period of time is Jewish, and to what extent are Jews constantly interacting with either non-Jews or even members yet here now of the African American race?
Well, in its heyday, 1 out of every 3 Jews, people in Harlem is Jewish.
33%.
At least 33%. These are very soft numbers. The softness, by the way, has to do with the geographical definition of what constitutes Harlem. I've had a friendly, ongoing discussion, debate with people who are members of the old Broadway Synagogue on 126th Street, a few steps east of Broadway, who claim that they're the oldest remaining synagogue in Harlem. And I always say, you're a great synagogue, you do wonderful things, but you're not in Harlem. So, the question of the geography of Harlem. But basically, 1/3 of the population is Jewish. Okay, there are boundary lines, ethnic boundary lines. So, for example, in East Harlem, from 96th Street, let's say, to 104th Street is predominantly East European Jews. When I did the first book, I did a lot of quantification. I looked at census materials, census data, and that was very hot in the industry of American Jewish historians. I think to some extent, fortunately, we've gone past that because the numbers don't really intrigue people. But north of 104th Street will be predominantly Italian, and the leading Italian politician was Fiorello LaGuardia, who is district leader in Harlem and then takes over a seat in East Harlem. And then Central Harlem, remember, Harlem would be defined on the west as up to Morningside Park, St. Nicholas Park, and then, of course, Washington Heights. So that if you're at Columbia, you're not in Harlem, you're in Morningside Heights. Ergo, when I look out the window, look down the bluff from Fairweather Hall, and you're a Columbia graduate, you know what I'm talking about. That's not Harlem, that's Morningside Heights. Anyway, 110th Street to 125th Street, before World War I, is overwhelmingly Jewish, and north of 125th Street is African American. Now, for me, the interesting thing is, within the African American community, and I had the numbers to support it 40 years ago, the almost complete white population as of World War I in the black section was Jewish, which tells me that back then, Jews did not have any specific predisposition to not want to live among African Americans. Having said that, since there's no one Jewish voice, the fact is when African Americans first flee to Harlem, because there were riots in 1900 in the Irish section of Hell's Kitchen, which was in the 60s, the mid-60s on the west side, where today Lincoln Center is. And if your viewers like old movies, you should know that when West Side Story was filmed on location, it was supposed to be East Side Story initially, but they changed it to West Side Story. It's true. Originally, it was going to be a Jewish and Italian boy. Then they changed it to a Latino girl and a Italian boy.
This is true.
It's true. Yeah, I can't make this up. It's true. It's true.
Leonard Bernstein was going to write a play, a movie.
Originally, it was called East Side. Yes, East Side Story.
Between
a Jew and an Italian.
Why did it change, do you think?
Because at that point in the late 50s, early 60s, the issue of tension between groups was not so much Jews versus Italian, right. Jews and Irish. It's now these Latinos coming in. He wanted to
so it was more relevant.
It was more relevant at that point. In any event, so blacks move up to Harlem, and they're living north of 125th Street. There are Jews who are part of the West Side Improvement Association, which was a restrictionist organization which tried to keep African Americans out. Mm-hmm. So the good and bad and ugly bounce back and forth throughout this book, and it begins at that time.
What about inside the Jewish community? We know that there are often rivalries and feuds and even hatreds among different groups of Jews. In Harlem, was the Jewish community unified? When you describe how it was almost every movement was represented in early Harlem history for the Jewish community, mm-hmm. Do you know of any discord that existed between and among Jews in Harlem?
Well, there has to be discord among groups, whether it's Jewish or non-Jewish, and there's some emblematic moments in time which we should talk about. I want to go back to this Uptown Talmud Torah for a moment, okay? To be, again, family biographical, my father went to a cheder, a one-room schoolhouse, as did all the other Gurock boys, where he learned next to nothing. And he would go when he wasn't playing hooky, and he would recite one or two prayers. He'd give the Malamed a penny, and then he'd go off and play stickball, and the end result was he became an outstanding stickball player. In any event, this Uptown Talmud Torah was one of the initiatives of the New York Kehillah, which was an organization which was designed to upgrade Jewish life in a variety of ways. And I know you're smiling because you know where I'm going to go, because your grandfather was part of that group who was engaged in Jewish education. In any event, there was a leading modern Orthodox layman. His name was Harry Fischel. He happened to be the father-in-law of Herbert S. Goldstein, who is the Rabbi of the Institutional Synagogue. And if any of your viewers go up to Yeshiva University and you go into the old house of study, the Beis HaMedrash, it's the Harry Fischel Beis Medrash. Right. Harry Fischel, Orthodox Jew, highly observant, referred to himself as the East European Jacob Schiff, which meant he was emulating Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff was one of the leading German-American Jewish philanthropists. If you go to Temple Emmanuel, you'll see his name on the wall. Very, very important American Jew. Any event, Fisher was involved with the Kehillah initiative, and he had a very progressive idea, lowercase p. He said, let's teach Bible stories using audio-visual media. So he goes out and he goes to a Christian publishing house, because there's no comparable Jewish one, and he buys a whole set of slides. They would call Old Testament slides. He buys a stereopticon machine, which people of our generation remember, Viewmaster, those little slides. This is even more primitive than that. He gives the slide machine, and he gives the slides to a teacher, and he says, use them to teach the Bible stories. So you see the children of Israel marching through the desert, and there's the pillar of smoke by night and the clouds by day. One night, one of the parents, or a group of parents, comes into the school. They find the machine, they find the slides, and they burn them. Because in their estimation, what Fischel is doing is violating the commandment of not making graven images of God. Hang on. Subsequent to that, the Morgen Journal, that's the strictly Orthodox newspaper, and frankly, to do this work, you have to use census materials, you have to use Anglo-Jewish newspaper, you have to be able to read the Yiddish press, publishes an editorial blaming Harry Fischel, saying, again, it's almost like Animal Farm. You, Orwellian, you become like them. You become like them. You've forgotten who you are. You become like the Jacob Schiffs. And they call for, not these words, but the implication, community control of the schools. Let the parents decide for themselves how they want to educate their youngsters. So here you have the German elite leadership and East European leadership getting along together. Remember, they're on the same board, and Fischer and Schiff is a major benefactor. You have other East European Jews say, wait a minute, we're not here as long as you are. We have stronger Jewish roots, and we want to maintain the traditions. I want to jump ahead 80, 90 years. I feel a great deal of warmth and connection to Chabad Lubavitch Hasidim. Just think about it. They use the most modern audio-visual activities to teach traditional subject matter all over the world. And in fact, the revival of Jewish life in Harlem begins where a wonderful rabbi who sadly died too young, Rabbi Gansbourg, comes to Harlem. Actually, it's almost like a positive version of the bonfire of the vanities. He gets on a bus, he ends up in Harlem, looks around and says, something's happening here. Next thing you know, Chabad is in Harlem. All I'm saying is the medium back then was important as far as the message, but again, things have changed dramatically. You want to hear one more story?
Yes.
Okay. 1916, there's a remarkable election in Harlem. 3 Jewish candidates run for Congress. First up is the socialist, Morris Hillquit. He had run in 08 to 1910, 08 on the Lower East Side, didn't do well. 1914, for a variety of reasons, Meyer London, a socialist like him, wins. So now the socialist says, we did it downtown, let's bring it uptown. The Forwards, the Forward, the socialist newspaper, not only publicizes the campaign, they run the campaign. They have, you talk about what's going on in the streets, they have marches through the streets, support Hillquit. Hillquit says, I'm a lawyer, I support working class Jews, vote for me. Second fella up, the Republican, Isaac Ike Siegel, who a year later, this is 1917, will become the president of Institutional Synagogue. He says, vote for me. I'm a proud Americanized Orthodox Jew. And here's a conundrum which I've never been able to figure out, and maybe one of your viewers will write to me and tell me the answer. One of his campaign slogans is, vote for me because if elected, I will be proud to speak a fluent Yiddish and a fluent English in the House of Representatives, which only begs the questions, with whom would he have spoken Yiddish? Well, the answer probably is Meyer London, but they didn't get along. Third fella up, Bernard Rosenblatt, not related to Yossela. He is by profession Columbia University graduate, as was Siegel. Rosenblatt says, vote for me. I'm executive secretary of the Federation of American Zionists. So you have three visions of what it means to be a Jew. Working class, Americanized Orthodox, and Zionist. Very close election. And Siegel wins because he's got a friend who is dominating the Italian electorate, which is a portion of that constituency. His name is LaGuardia. So after 3 terms in Congress, Ike Siegel becomes a state Supreme Court justice, and LaGuardia sort of inherits the district. Not so simple. When he runs for Congress in 1922 as a Republican candidate with a socialist orientation too, he runs against a German-American Jew named Henry Frank, who accuses LaGuardia of being an anti-Semite. And LaGuardia, whose mother was Jewish, spoke a fluent Yiddish. And he demanded that there be a debate over my alleged anti-Semitism to be conducted totally in Yiddish. And Frank couldn't do it, and that sort of sealed that fate. So here you have different visions of what it means to Jews, and also suggests that, generally speaking, Italians and Jews got along pretty well. Not so much with the Irish. A lot of tension with the Irish.
Oh, doesn't it sound like such a rich Jewish culture at that time?
Very much so, very much so. But rich Jewish cultures at that time, because there is a radical culture, a socialist culture, there's an Orthodox culture, and then this is the idea of trying to create an American type of Jewish identity. You know, those folks who live on I was going to say Central Avenue, but Central Harlem, they're experiencing something that predates suburbanization. They've moved from the Jewish hub, albeit they're still living in a Jewish neighborhood. Are they going to continue to maintain their Jewish identity? It's sort of easy when you are still un-Americanized to adhere to those types of things. But now you're moving into an ethnic identity, and it starts here. And again, I should say, I focused on Harlem, pre-World War I. You also have early Williamsburg and early Brownsville.
Yes.
Remember, when those bridges are finally built, the good news is that it facilitates people suburbanizing, moving over to Brooklyn, and they have a similar story to tell.
Okay. But where were your parents?
So my grandparents lived on 100th Street and Park Avenue. That's where my father grew up.
Right.
Right.
Your mother?
My mother grew up in Brooklyn, a strictly Orthodox family. Her brother, my Uncle Louis, was a student at the early Yeshiva University, which became Yeshiva University. He was a classmate of the great Orthodox Rabbi Joseph Goldstein, and he was a Talmud Torah teacher in Brooklyn for many years. And my maternal grandfather was a shochet, and my mother had very few memories of her father except for the fact that he was becoming Americanized. And I wrote about this in my Orthodoxy book. He was becoming Americanized, and he wanted to be beardless. So he didn't. It was before the electric razors, so he used a depilatory, but it was sulfur-based depilatory. And her memory of her father is that when he used that hair remover, it stank to high heaven and stank up the entire apartment. So that was the learner side of the family.
Okay.
And the Gurocs were in Harlem.
Okay.
And again, they had come from White Russia. I thought for many years that they came in 03. It was a pogrom in the town. Turns out they came in 05. One of the things that I became aware of that's available not only to professional historians but to amateurs, and people can do it, is Ancestry.com. I was able, apart from my own family, I was able to trace a particular family from the 1860s when the family first came, the German-American family, first came to Lower East Side, followed them, the family, all the way through the 1940s. Then I lost track of them. And with the help of an outstanding genealogist named Karen Franklin, we found a great-great-granddaughter of Israel and Emma Stone. I called her up. She's 87 years old, lives in Sherman Oaks, California. I called her up. I said, I'm Professor Gurock, and I'm not selling anything. And I said, are you related? And sure enough, and she said to me, how'd you find me? Well, I found her. And sadly for me, I wish I could say that. And she told me that she has a daughter or son who's moved back to Harlem. Didn't work. So I have to be honest. I could have made it up, but I left it out of the book.
Okay. So you've taken us through Harlem a bit. I want to know what happens at the end. In other words, at some point, Harlem loses its Jewish population. And your book talks about a revival.
Right.
So I want to know about those two pieces. At what point do Jews leave Harlem, and why in the world are they coming back?
Okay. The original Jewish community in Harlem, which, by the way, goes back to 1870. German Jews are there first, then East European Jews are there second. Almost everyone leaves after World War I. They leave after World War I because one of the pieces of American history, after the war, there are race riots all over the country. Whites come back from World War I. They fought a war to make the world safe for democracy, and they find African Americans in their neighborhood. The city fathers, in their wisdom, and I say city fathers because women only got the vote in 1920. Actually, New York was ahead of the game, 1916. Passed a remarkable real estate law that says if you build an apartment building in an underdeveloped part of the city, you'll be free from 10 years or more of real estate taxes. So under that mandate, whole new communities begin to spring up all over the city really quickly. The west side of Manhattan, Washington Heights. Washington Heights is East European before the Germans arrived during the rise of Hitler. The Grand Concourse in the Bronx, White Plains Road in the Bronx. Over in Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, Borough Park, Midwood, all become Jewish communities. Over in Queens, Bayside, Jamaica, Astoria. The only place that's off limits to Jews is Forest Hills. And I always say today, Forest Hills is off limits to Gentiles. And that's not true either because it's become a much more multicultural neighborhood. If I can brag again for a moment, my late Uncle Bill, who was an immigration attorney, he and his wife, who's blessed to be still around today, she's age 97, lived in Forest Hills Gardens in the 1960s, a place which was off limits some 15 years earlier. So Jews who were doing better flocked from central Harlem to these areas. When that happens, that neighborhood is opened up for more African Americans who move in, who fled the South because of racism, only to encounter racism in the city. And the boll weevil epidemic, they move in. And what of the aspiring African Americans who are there early? What happens to them? Well, because of racism, because of restriction, you should know that this city of New York was a very segregated city for the longest time. They are, whereas we are concerned with Forest Hills, there's so many places you can't move to if you're doing well, middle-class African Americans. Where do they live? They live either in Strivers Row, a string of brownstones on 136th to 138th Street between 8th and 9th Avenue, or up near City College, where there are private homes. So that's where that's again talking about the differing fates of Jews and blacks. So Jews move out of Harlem. They're also moving out of the Lower East Side. They're also moving out of Old Williamsburg and Brownsville. That's the end of that line. Now, I get
is it also economically propelled?
Yes, economically propelled. Jews are doing better in the 1920s. They're able to move on. And you do as well as you possibly can till 1929, and then you're stuck. And nobody moves again. There's something called the Great Depression, then World War II. Then after World War II, people move out to suburbia. Okay. Jews coming back. We're living in an era of gentrification in New York City. Harlem is, in some respects, behind other communities that have sprung up.
In New York.
In New York. and by the way, all over the country. So Jews are part of a Caucasian return to Harlem, because those brownstones, like the Borgenics lived in, are still, when rehabbed, are as beautiful as they were back 100 years earlier. And as of 2010, there are more Caucasians than there are African Americans. Bill Clinton establishing his office building, a lot of it's going on. One of the things that I end the book with, one of my concerns is, since at the end of the day, ultimately more a Jewish historian than anything else, is Jews are returning to the neighborhood. From what I can tell, they are being received very favorably by other middle-class people who happen to be African American, some of them who didn't live in Harlem, who've moved in. The question of Jewish survival is a religious and identity one. How Jewish will these people want to be? Back in 1917, there were hundreds of synagogues, and people were very engaged in this, although many people never went to synagogue. One of the things we have to look at is Jews are comfortable in Harlem. How comfortable is Judaism returning to Harlem? And the last chapter is called The Beginnings of Return, which emphasized the fact that there's a Chabad in the area. There is a new Harlem Jewish Community Center, which is making its impact slowly. There's a remarkable school called the Harlem Hebrew Language Academy Charter School, a charter school which teaches bilingually English and Hebrew to a student body which is half Jewish and half non-Jewish. And I have visited there, and I've done some work with them. You see these beautiful little 6-year-old African-American kids and Latino kids speaking Israeli accented Hebrew. They don't teach religion, because it's a funded school. And then after school, the Steinhardt Foundation, which has done wonderful work with Birthright, etc., has initiated a Talmud Torah, providing these kids with education. It's only the beginning. A lot more needs to be. I heard a rumor a couple days ago that there's someone out there who's thinking of buying the church that took over from Ohab Zedek. That would be dynamite, And
making a synagogue.
And making it back into a synagogue. So
wouldn't that be fabulous?
That would be fabulous. It would be very interesting. So I've always seen myself as Harlem's Jewish historian, and I hope that...
you might have to write one more book yet.
Well,
you might have to.
I have other books in mind, but I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for Harlem. That's for sure.
You're fabulous.
Well, I'm okay.
You're fabulous. And you're a dear, dear friend, and you do incredible work. By the way, if there's anybody watching anywhere in America who wants a fabulous weekend, you bring Jeff Gurock to your community, synagogue community, JCC community, whatever it is. And he will, you can tell by what he loves to tell stories. The lovely thing about the Jews of Harlem, it's filled with stories. It's a great read, and he is a great storyteller who also has a profound sense of what it is to be a Jew in this complicated world of ours. Kol tuva hatzlacha, all the best to you. You and I will continue to sit here very, very often. All the best with the next of your 16, 17, 25, 30 books that you will do. And every time you write one, you'll sit in that chair and be with me.
It will be my pleasure, as it's always been. Thank you very much.
Dr. Jeffrey S. Gurock, author of The Jews of Harlem, The Rise, Decline, and Revival of a Jewish Community. It's published by New York University Press. It belongs in every home library. As always, I ask you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the things that Jeff had to say. And he's asked you if there are any things you can fill in for him, if there's a piece you know about the Jews of Harlem, Jews of New York, you email me. I will pass your emails on to him. So please, email me, write me, post it on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you this week. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
Jewish Education in Media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.